July 1553 was an action-packed month in Tudor England. In the space of just 13 days, it saw the death of one monarch, the proclamation of another who'd never be crowned, and the accession of still another, a woman who would become England's first crowned queen regnant. 3 monarchs in 1 month. No foreign invasion, no pitched battle, and the kingdom came close to civil war. At the centre of this crisis were 3 very different figures. A teenage king dying slowly, fully aware of what his death would unleash. A young woman proclaimed queen but trapped inside plans not of her making. And another woman who would win the crown not by force but through legitimacy, organisation and popular support. To understand July 1553, we need to understand what Edward VI was trying to protect and what his half-sister Mary represented to him. I'm historian and author Claire Ridgway, and let me guide you through the events of that summer and what led up to it. In January 1547, Edward became king on the death of his father Henry VIII. Edward was just 9 years old. He never ruled independently. His government was led first by his maternal uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, as Lord Protector, and later by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, as Lord President of the King's Council. Edward's reign saw an acceleration of Protestant reform that fundamentally reshaped religious life in England. The Mass was abolished, churches were stripped of images, traditional processions were banned. And in 1549, the Book of Common Prayer replaced the Latin Mass with an English service, much to his half-sister Mary's dismay. She remained openly Catholic. She maintained traditional worship within her household, and she was prepared to disobey royal injunctions. She was a problem throughout Edward's reign, even stating that she would lay her head on a block before compromising her faith. In April 1552, Edward became ill with a double dose of smallpox and measles. Miraculously, he survived, but it's believed that the bout of illness suppressed his immune system. 9 months later, when he became ill with some kind of pulmonary infection, he just couldn't fight it off. It had started with a cough in early January 1553, and when Mary visited him on the 10th of February, she found him bedridden. Although he'd rallied at various points, by the 20th of May the imperial ambassador described Edward's condition as desperate, and on the 30th of May he described him as wasting away daily. Edward realised he was dying and set about planning for the future of his kingdom, and the succession was a problem. Following the annulments of the marriages to Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, Edward's father Henry VIII had had his daughters Mary and Elizabeth made illegitimate by Acts of Parliament. However, before he died, although their illegitimacy was not overturned, they were restored to the succession after Edward. This meant that by his father's will, on Edward's death, Mary would become queen, because Edward was childless. If Mary succeeded him, England's religious direction would change. That was not speculation, it was a certainty. All Edward's religious legislation would be undone, and Mary would return England to the authority of Rome. Edward could not allow this to happen. So he wrote his device for the succession, his plan to disinherit his illegitimate half-sisters and to create what he described as a new dynasty, one founded upon the true faith. The original draft stipulated that the crown would descend through the male heirs of Edward's first cousin Frances, Duchess of Suffolk, and the male heirs of her children, Frances being the daughter of Mary Tudor, Queen of France, who in turn was the daughter of King Henry VII. The problem was that there were no male heirs yet. So when Edward made a turn for the worse, he decided to change the device to read, "To the Lady Frances's heirs male, if she have any such issue before my death, to the Lady Jane and her heirs male. So if Frances didn't give birth to a son before Edward's death, the throne was to pass on to her eldest daughter, Jane, Lady Jane Grey, who was the same age as Edward and had just got married to Lord Guildford Dudley, son of the leader of Edward's government, the Duke of Northumberland. On the 11th of June, the imperial ambassador reported that the king's indisposition is becoming graver and graver. And on the 12th of June, the judges of the King's Bench were shown the King's device and ordered to turn it into a legal will. The judges refused, as they were worried that overturning the succession would be considered treason. But Edward explained the reasons behind his decision, and I quote, "For indeed my sister Mary was the daughter of the king by Catherine the Spaniard, who before she was married to my worthy father had been espoused to Arthur, my father's elder brother, and was therefore for this reason alone divorced by my father. But it was the fate of Elizabeth, my other sister, to have Anne Boleyn for a mother. This woman was indeed not only cast off by my father because she was more inclined to couple with a number of courtiers rather than reverencing her husband, so mighty a king, but also paid the penalty with her head, a greater proof of her guilt. Thus, in our judgment, they will be undeservedly considered as being numbered among the heirs of the king, our beloved father." Edward demanded that the judges should accept his wishes and legalise his device. Refusal would be seen as treason. Edward got his wish, and the letters patent were drawn up. It is often said that Edward was merely a passive figurehead during his reign, and that he was simply a pawn, and that his device wasn't his at all, but the wishes of the Duke of Northumberland, who'd married his son off to Lady Jane Grey in a bid to keep power. But that is to misunderstand Edward completely and to do both him and Northumberland a huge disservice. Historian David Loades writes of how Lord Protector Somerset had made the mistake of ignoring Edward, but that by the time he was 14, the king was precocious, opinionated, and very much aware of who he was. Northumberland saw that and worked with the young man, mentoring him and working with him. And there is so much evidence to show that Edward knew his own mind. You only have to look at his treatment of Mary when she defied his religious measures. He kept putting pressure on her. He had members of her household imprisoned, and things got so bad that the emperor and his ambassador put plans in place for Mary to flee the country, and that was Edward's doing. And then there's Edward's device for the succession, the wording he uses about Mary and her younger half-sister Elizabeth, calling them of the half-blood and therefore not inheritable of his crown. He truly believed that his half-sisters were not lawfully begotten and not true heirs to the throne. This was a young man who knew what he wanted and thought he knew what was right. He was nobody's pawn. On the 19th of June, the imperial ambassador reported to the emperor that the king had sunk so rapidly since my last letter of the 15th that the physicians no longer dare to answer for it that he will last one day more. His state is such that the king himself has given up hope and says he feels so weak that he can resist no longer and that he is done for. However, on the 4th of July, it was reported that Edward had appeared at a window at Greenwich some days before to prove to everyone that he was still alive, but that he was so thin and wasted that all men said he was doomed. Between 8 and 9 o'clock on the evening of the 6th of July 1553, in the arms of Sir Henry Sidney, one of the chief gentlemen of his privy chamber, Edward uttered his final words: "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me and take my spirit." Then he died. Edward's successor, Lady Jane Grey, or Lady Jane Dudley, was informed of the king's death and her own accession by her father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland. She was shocked. Jane collapsed weeping, declaring, "The crown is not my right and pleases me not. The Lady Mary is the rightful heir." However, Northumberland and Jane's parents then explained Edward's wishes to her. It had been Edward's express desire that she should be queen and continued the English Reformation. The pious Jane accepted the crown as her duty and her destiny. Jane later told of what happened. Declaring to them my insufficiency, I greatly bewailed myself for the death of so noble a prince, and at the same time turned myself to God, humbly praying and beseeching him that if what was given to me was rightfully and lawfully mine, his divine majesty would grant me such grace and spirit that I might govern it to his glory and service and to the advantage of this realm. On the 8th of July, local magistrates in London were quietly informed of the late king's instructions for the succession. Edward's death was still being concealed from them at this point, but they were ordered to spread the message that Lady Jane Grey was Edward's lawful heir. The next day, Nicholas Ridley, Bishop of London, preached at St Paul's Cross in London, denouncing Mary and Elizabeth as bastards. However, he did not get the support he was hoping for. The crowd was described as sore annoyed with his words. On the 10th of July, Jane, her husband Guildford, her parents, the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk, and Guildford's mother, the Duchess of Northumberland, travelled by barge on the Thames from Sion to the Tower of London, where they were received between 4 and 5 p.m. by the Duke of Northumberland, Jane and Guildford walking under the canopy of state. Diarist Henry Machin records that Jane was greeted with a gun salute and that before 6 o'clock had struck, a trumpet blew and 2 heralds declared that Edward VI's half-sister Mary was unlawfully begotten and proclaimed that Jane was queen. The heralds then moved on to Cheapside and Fleet Street, proclaiming their message again. That very same day, the Royal Council received a rather disturbing letter. It was from the Lady Mary. In it, Mary stated her claim to the throne and demanded their allegiance. She wrote of how she'd heard the news of her half-brother's death, news that she described as being woeful unto our hearts. She then pointed out that the council could not be ignorant of the fact that an Act of Parliament and her father's last will had given her the right to be queen, and that her right and title should be published and proclaimed accordingly. She commented that it seemeth strange that she'd received no official news of the king's death from the council, but that she had great hope and trust and much assurance in their loyalty and service, and that they would, like noblemen, work the best. Mary made it clear that she was not ignorant of what was going on, some evil, she called it, but that she was ready to remit and fully pardon them, to eschew bloodshed and vengeance. She concluded by demanding that on receipt of her letter, they should proclaim her right and title to the crown in London and such other places as to your wisdoms shall seem good. How did the council react? Well, they arrested the messenger Thomas Hungate, throwing him in the Tower of London. So let's now look at what Mary had been up to, what had led to this letter. On the 3rd of July 1553, Mary, who was at Hunsdon in Hertfordshire, received news that the king was dying and that there was an aristocratic conspiracy against her. Fearing that she'd be taken into custody to prevent her from laying claim to the throne, Mary decided to flee. The next evening, pretending that she needed to move residence due to her physician being gravely ill, Mary left with the intention of making her way to East Anglia, where she knew she had support. By the 7th of July, Mary had reached Euston Hall near Thetford in Norfolk, the home of Lady Borough. It was there that she received the most momentous news of all, the death of her brother. The news was brought to her by her goldsmith, Robert Raines, who'd ridden hard from London. But how did Raines know? The king's death had not yet been publicly announced, and even Lady Jane Grey herself was still unaware at this point. Historian Dermot McCulloch points to a poem said to have been written by Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, which claimed that Raines had been informed of Edward's death by Throckmorton himself and sent directly to Mary. Yet Mary did not act at once. She was deeply cautious. Before making any move, she needed absolute confirmation of her brother's death. McCulloch even wonders whether her hesitation was influenced by Throckmorton's known Protestant sympathies. This was a moment where one misstep could be fatal, and Mary had no intention of walking into a trap and being accused of treason. Instead, she made a swift but calculated decision to ride on to Kenninghall, the former seat of the imprisoned Duke of Norfolk. It was there that certainty finally came. Dr. Thomas Hughes brought formal confirmation that the king was indeed dead. On the 8th of July, Mary gathered her household at Kenninghall and announced Edward's death. She then declared unequivocally that the right to the crown of England had therefore descended to her by divine and by human law. Her words were met with cheers. Those present proclaimed her queen. It was the following day that she wrote to the Royal Council demanding their allegiance and for them to proclaim her queen. But that wasn't the only thing she did. She also wrote to the peers of the realm, calling on their support. England now had two queens, one proclaimed by the Royal Council in London and one self-proclaimed in East Anglia. The crisis had truly begun. In London, events were moving rapidly. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, Lord President of Edward VI's Council, had learnt that Mary had fled. He immediately moved to secure the Tower of London, organised troops and positioned the royal fleet, ordering 6 ships to be stationed off the East Anglian coast. Officially, this was to defend England against any foreign intervention on Mary's behalf and to prevent her, of course, from escaping to the continent to seek aid from her cousin, Emperor Charles V. In Ipswich, Sir Thomas Cornwallis, Sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk, along with Thomas Wentworth and other local gentlemen, publicly declared for Queen Jane. On paper, this looked like a success for the London government, but that confidence didn't last long. While they were still in the marketplace, Mary's receiver, Thomas Polly arrived and boldly proclaimed Mary Queen instead. According to historian John Edwards, the response was immediate and unmistakable. The crowd's enthusiasm for Mary was so overwhelming that Cornwallis and his companions rapidly changed their minds and declared for Mary. The following day, the 12th of July, Mary made a decisive move. She left Kenninghall and rode to Framlingham Castle, a formidable fortress and a powerful symbol of East Anglian strength. From there, she began to organise her claim in earnest. She was willing to fight. Meanwhile, back in London, the council was growing anxious. A muster was called on Tothill Fields in Westminster, and according to the Chronicle of Queen Jane, it was decided that Henry Grey, Jane's own father, should lead a force to fetch Mary and bring her to London. That same day, Mary was proclaimed queen in the city of Norwich. Between the 12th and the 15th of July, Mary's support snowballed. Men of influence and experience sided with her. Sir Edward Hastings, Henry Radcliffe, Sir Henry Bedingfield, John de Vere, and powerful East Anglian families such as the Rochesters, Jerninghams and Waldegraves. And Robert Wingfield wrote of how these men organised troops for Mary and that they turned an unskilled and disorganised mob into skilled and disciplined soldiers, obedient to orders and eager to meet the enemy. The people of East Anglia were incredibly loyal to Mary and were ready to put their lives on the line for her. Mary was proclaimed queen across counties and towns. This was no longer a local rising. It had become a national movement. And Mary visited her troops. Wingfield records that the soldiers offered her such reverence that I had serious doubts whether they could have given greater adoration to God if he'd come down from heaven. In return, Mary spoke to her forces with what Wingfield describes as exceptional kindness, a wonderfully relaxed approach, winning everyone's affections. Meanwhile, back in London, Confidence in Queen Jane was beginning to crumble at the very centre of government. By the 13th of July, senior councillors such as William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, and Henry Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, were already questioning whether they were backing the wrong horse. And then came the ships. On the 14th of July, in Ipswich, Sir Henry Jerningham learnt that the royal ships guarding the East Anglian coast had mutinied. The reason was simple. They'd not been paid, and they deeply resented the disowning of Mary. And these ships were loaded with men and weapons. That same day, men finally left London to apprehend Mary, marching towards Cambridge. They were led not by Henry Grey, but by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Queen Jane, worried about her father's ill health, made the mistake of allowing the council to send the one man who'd been holding them all together. Northumberland stayed overnight at Ware, joined by his sons, and issued harsh orders. Lord George Howard was commanded to sack and burn Sawston Hall, where Mary had stayed. A missal and chalice used by Mary to hear Mass were seized. But Northumberland was already too late. On the 15th of July, Jerningham personally visited the mutinous ships and asked them to support Mary instead of Queen Jane. The crews did not hesitate. Their allegiance shifted without resistance. Northumberland reached Cambridge unaware that his real danger was not Mary's army, but London itself, where the council had lost its leader. By the 16th of July, Mary was receiving reports that forces in Oxfordshire were preparing to march on Westminster to seize key figures holding the palace in Jane's name. That evening, as the Chronicle of Queen Jane records, the gates of the Tower of London were suddenly shut and the keys delivered to Queen Jane. It was a defensive gesture and a desperate one. On the 18th of July, with Northumberland marching away from London and Mary's support swelling, the decisive betrayal took place. The Earls of Pembroke and Arundel convened a council meeting and argued that Mary's claim was not only stronger, it was lawful. They persuaded their colleagues that continuing to support Jane was both dangerous and indefensible. One account records Pembroke drawing his sword and declaring, "If the arguments of my Lord of Arundel do not persuade you, this sword shall make Mary queen, or I will die in her quarrel." Without Northumberland to argue Jane's case, it was an easy decision. The council turned to Mary's cause. The following day, the 19th of July, the crisis ended. 13 days after Edward's death, Mary I was proclaimed Queen in London. Henry Machin records that she was proclaimed between 5 and 6 o'clock p.m. at Cheapside Cross, being proclaimed Queen of England, France and Ireland, and being explicitly identified as Edward VI's sister and Henry VIII's daughter. Present were a host of nobles, civic officials, heralds and trumpeters. London rejoiced. Bells rang throughout the night. Bonfires were lit in every street. Te Deums were sung. Crowds filled the streets. Wine and ale flowed, and money was thrown to the people. Contemporary accounts speak of widespread rejoicing and good cheer, and parish bells rang wherever the news travelled. England had a new queen. Mary herself was still at Framlingham and wouldn't learn of her triumph until the following day, when William Paget and the Earl of Arundel arrived with the news. Inside the Tower of London that evening, Lady Jane Grey's father, the Duke of Suffolk, interrupted her evening meal to inform her that she was no longer queen. The canopy of state was torn down. Jane remained in the Tower, where she'd soon become Mary's prisoner. Her execution would come months later, in February 1554, following her father's involvement in Wyatt's rebellion. On the 23rd of July, the Duke of Northumberland surrendered at Cambridge following the desertion of most of his troops, and he and his sons were arrested, taken back to London and imprisoned in the Tower. In writing of Mary's victory, Robert Wingfield notes that the very fierce enemy was defeated without bloodshed or even a fight, and that Mary's first priority was arranging with her chaplains that they should give thanks and pour forth prayers to God, who was the first and sole author of this victory. He goes on to say, since Queen Mary had averted the most dangerous and serious war, nothing was more preferable to Her Highness than to have the realm cleansed of divisive parties, to take precautions for the state, and through her godliness, mercy, and justice, to begin her reign with birds of good omen, as they say. The succession crisis of July 1553 was not decided by battle, nor by foreign invasion, nor by brute force. It was decided by legitimacy, organisation, and the ability to command loyalty. Mary had won, and Edward VI's carefully constructed Protestant succession had collapsed in less than a fortnight. But what about Elizabeth, Edward and Mary's half-sister? Where had she been during all of this? Well, she'd stayed out of things at her estate at Hatfield, keeping her own counsel and watching carefully as the realm split between two claimants. She left Hatfield as soon as she heard news of Mary's victory, entering the City of London on the 29th of July and making her way to her London home, Somerset House. On the 2nd of August, she rode to Wanstead to greet Mary, and the following day they rode to Aldgate so that Mary could enter the city as England's new queen. At Aldgate, the Lord Mayor and aldermen formally welcomed Mary, kneeling before her and presenting the sceptre of the city. Mary responded warmly, thanking them and assuring them of her goodwill. Witnesses record that she spoke so graciously and with such warmth that many onlookers wept with joy. It was a carefully staged triumph, an entry designed to display authority, legitimacy, and overwhelming public support. Mary was escorted through the city with great ceremony. The streets leading to the Tower were gravelled, hung with rich cloths, banners and streamers, and lined with the livery companies of London, each standing in ordered ranks beneath their banners. Trumpets sounded continuously, heralds rode before her, and cannon fired from the Tower in a thunderous salute that contemporary witnesses described as almost earthquake-like. She was accompanied by an extraordinary procession. Hundreds of gentlemen in velvet coats rode before her, followed by ladies, nobles, city officials, and thousands of armed horsemen. Estimates of those riding with her ranged from several thousand to as many as 10,000. The sheer size of the escort made one point unmistakably clear. Mary did not arrive as a contested claimant, but as England's undisputed monarch. At her side rode the leading men of the realm. The Earl of Arundel bore the sword of state before her. Sir Anthony Browne carried her train, and the Lord Mayor of London rode close by, bearing the mace as a symbol of the city's submission and loyalty. Following Mary rode Elizabeth, then the Duchess of Norfolk and other noble women. Mary herself was richly dressed in purple velvet, embroidered with gold, pearls and precious stones. Her appearance impressed observers deeply, reinforcing the majesty of queenship after weeks of uncertainty and divided rule. Along the route, children from Christ's Hospital addressed her with a Latin oration. Mary paused to listen, though she made no public reply. Music played from raised stages, singers performed, and the crowds pressed in so thickly that movement was difficult. Everywhere, people shouted prayers for her safety and reign, many openly crying with relief and happiness. When Mary reached the Tower, she was met by those who'd once been imprisoned there under her half-brother's regime, including the Duke of Norfolk, Stephen Gardiner, and Edward Courtenay, who knelt before her and asked forgiveness. That evening, the procession ended without disorder. Despite the vast crowds and the presence of so many armed men, the city remained peaceful. Her victorious entry showed that Mary's rule was publicly ratified, not just by law and council, but but by spectacle and popular acclamation. That day had not been merely ceremonial. It was political theatre on a grand scale, a visible statement that the succession crisis was over, order was restored, and legitimate monarchy reaffirmed. Mary was a queen welcomed home by her people.